So in the previous video, we talked about some of the characteristics of research, what is research, and I'm going to continue that a bit further with the distinction between descriptive and causal research. And in many ways, the outline of the course reflects this distinction, as well as the book we wrote for the course. The first part of the course deals with more descriptive research strategies, things like measurement and sampling, and the later part of the course will deal more with causal research and what's required to demonstrate cause and effect. Descriptive research is the idea that sometimes research aims simply to describe the way things are. And it answers, in a sense, what is questions. Causal research, on the other hand, aims to explain how things happen or how they can be changed, how we can influence the world. And in that sense, they look at what if questions. What if we made a policy change, for example? So let me take the case of recycling. So a descriptive research question related to recycling might be: how much do people recycle? What percentage of households recycle? Is recycling going up or down? Are people recycling more than they did years ago? So there are many interesting descriptive questions related to recycling. A causal research might aim to explain how or why people recycle, or what influences how much they recycle. So what if we gave people more information? Would they recycle more? Or, what if we, gave people certain incentives to recycle? Would they recycle more? A causal question might look at factors, both policy factors or psychological factors, that influence a behavior like recycling. So I'd like to talk now a little bit about the scientific method. This course is about methods, and it's about scientific study. So what do we mean by that? What do we mean by science and by the scientific method? Well, to begin with, we should think about the notion of epistemology, which is a way of knowing about the world. The scientific method is one of a number of ways of knowing about the world. We know about the world through social tradition, through religious tradition, through um, you know the opinions and advice of authorities. In the scientific tradition, though, we rely on a set of sort of procedures and principles uh, that are really sort of the basis of the scientific method. Although I should point out that there's ongoing and constant debate within science about what counts as science and what are the features of the scientific method, and even what is the scientific method. So this isn't settled. It's just these are sort of characteristics that I think most people in both the social and the physical sciences would probably agree count as key features of science. One is systematic observation. The science observes the world systematically, usually in the form of measurements of various kinds, and records those observations. And that's a key contribution of science. This systematic measurement and tracking and recording of various events in the natural and social world. Science also involves logical explanations. The explanations given by a scientific theory need to be consistent and logical. That's a complicated thing to determine sometimes, but uh, there are certain generally agreed ideas about what counts as a logical explanation, and science relies on those sorts of logical explanations, and these usually take the form of theories or models about how the world works. And then to test those models, science involves prediction. It involves testing theories or hypotheses against reality. And this means that theories and ideas about how the world works are exposed to potential falsification. They can be disproved or disconfirmed. So that's a very important characteristic of science. It's not just ideas about how the world works, but ideas that have been exposed to empirical reality and have been um, confirmed by that process. Um, Another important characteristic of science, a very important characteristic, is that it's open, it's transparent. The methods that scientists use, as well as the findings, are clearly documented, and this allows replication or checking up on the findings of a study by repeating it. So the openness of the scientific endeavor is very much a key component. And finally, science involves a fair amount of skepticism, criticism, competition. Researchers scrutinize, review, critique each other's work. This is embodied in what's known as the peer review process. Scientists review and scrutinize each other's work. And so that's another important characteristic of science. So science, it's a social activity as well as a kind of a logical activity. There's a social element to science in which people share, communicate research, criticize, debate. That's very much a part of the scientific method. So So I want to introduce two ways in which science operates. These are somewhat ideal types. Many studies involve a combination of the two. But the processes are induction and deduction. So let me begin with induction. Induction is where you, and this may seem sort of the more natural process. Induction begins, and I'm going to start over here, with some problem or curiosity or social issue in the world, and we're going to follow this arrow here, and the first thing we do is begin describing it, collect observations, make measurements, conduct surveys, track trends, and when we build up enough observations, we can then induce a possible explanation for what's going on. And so we start with observation and then develop our logical explanation out of that. Now that may seem to be all that we need to do, but the problem with this is that the explanations we develop can't really be falsified. If we rely only on deduction, I may have one explanation for what I see in the data or in the observations. You may have another, and there's no way to test those because we've developed our ideas out of the same sort of set of observations and measurements. So that leads to the need for deduction. So deduction is where you start with a problem or curiosity, but you develop your explanation first, and then you develop that maybe out of theories or prior evidence. But the explanation comes first, and then the scientist following a deductive approach, then tests then deduces a prediction or a hypothesis that's then tested with systematic observation. Now, in this case, in the deductive loop, we could be wrong. We could get to the systematic observation part and find that our observations are not consistent with our explanation, because we notice that in the deductive loop we have the explanation first, then we make an observation. So it can be falsified, and that's, remember from the previous discussion, that's an important part of the scientific method, is to expose our ideas to possible falsification. In the inductive loop, we start with the observation, and the explanation comes after the fact, and that's a limit of induction. And often research in a field involves both processes. So we would start with a problem, something like obesity, childhood obesity. We'd make some observations: what's causing it, what are the factors. We might develop an explanation right here, but then that explanation would have to suggest new predictions or things that haven't yet been observed, and then we would get into the deductive loop and see if we confirm or reject our explanation. So there are ways in which induction, often in many fields, there are inductive and deductive processes going on at the same time. Inductive studies, deductive studies, feeding on each other in this kind of a loop that leads to further predictions, which then lead to more observations, which may then turn up surprising findings, which lead to modifications in the explanations, which lead to, more hypotheses that are then tested with new observations, and that's in many ways a typical scientific process. So I'd like to conclude with a few words about the ethics of research. Social and policy research is shaped by ethical considerations. Much of what's done or is possible to do should be understood in terms of what's considered ethical under current regulations and principles that have been developed, to some extent out of some fairly egregious violations of ethical principles in past scientific research involving human subjects. So we'll talk about ethical issues throughout the course. Ethics is an important consideration in most of the methods that we will talk about. So we'll bring this issue up again from week to week. But let me start with a few broad principles. One is respect for persons. This is the idea that people participating in research should be informed. They should participate voluntarily and not be coerced. So research should respect sort of the individual, the will and the freedom of people to participate in an informed way in research studies. Another broad principle is beneficence, and that's the idea that research should benefit people and certainly not harm people. And there are risks in some studies, and people need to understand those risks, and those risks should be justified by the benefits that people might receive from the research. So it's, for example, it's not fair to, or it's not, it doesn't satisfy a principle of beneficence if people are harmed in a study in order to benefit people outside the study. The principle of beneficence is applied to people in the study. It's also applied to the broader idea of whether the research is beneficial to society. We don't want to do trivial research or research that has no practical purpose. So that's a second major principle. And finally, there's the principle of justice in research, that research should be equitable and fair with respect to who in society participates in as a research subject. For example, it's not fair to have poor communities participate in research that predominantly benefits wealthy communities, or increasingly an issue in medical studies these days is whether it's ethical to conduct clinical trials in developing countries to develop medicines or treatments, sometimes high-risk clinical trials in developing countries to develop drugs that benefit people primarily in developed countries. So the issue of justice in who participates in research is an important consideration.